Hello and welcome everybody to Marketing Leader Circle and Bring It On Summit. I'd like to introduce you to Robert Norum, who will be taking this session, which is all about account-based marketing techniques and how it should be done properly. So Robert is an account-based marketing expert and trainer, growth marketer and marketing consultant. He's got over 30 years experience in B2B marketing, working for media clients and agencies. He's spent almost the last decade, 9 years to be exact, specializing in ABM, where he's worked with some of the world's largest companies and their agencies to develop their account-based marketing strategy and to really deliver global programs. So we're fortunate enough to have an expert on this matter to join us today. He also runs ABM training courses specifically for B2B marketers, and over the last 5 years has trained over 500 delegates in the process. So without further ado, I will open the floor and hand it over to Robert.
Great, thanks Nikita. Let me just find my presentation and we can get cracking. Okay, so the good news is Nikita's already done the introduction, so I don't need to be telling you anything about myself. What I do need to do, though, is to get the presentation into display mode, which hopefully you can now see clearly. So I've called this a whistle-stop tour of everything you need to know about ABM in the context that we have about 20 minutes. So clearly we'll be touching each topic fairly lightly, but hopefully this will give you a pretty solid intro and overview of how I would train on ABM and how I would advise you approach it. So in terms of the agenda, a little bit around getting started, a section around developing your ABM strategy, a piece around selecting the right accounts, and then looking at the ABM process in more detail before we have a look at the program, and then finally a piece on measuring success. And the ambition is to finish with at least 5 minutes to spare so that we can ask a few questions, or I can answer a few questions. So in terms of getting started with ABM, there are some fundamentals. And the first one, which may sound a little obvious, is you really need to define ABM for your business. If you've done any cursory research into the subject, you'll see that there are all kinds of approaches and a lot of organizations obviously trying to kind of take ownership of the space. The first thing to say about account-based marketing is, whilst it's clearly got marketing in the title, it really needs to be a company initiative. And without any question at all, you need sales and marketing working really closely together. But beyond that, I think the most important thing is that you have a really clear way of discussing it and talking about it so that you can bring your key stakeholders, your marketing teams and your salespeople with you. In terms of giving you a working definition, I would say that ABM is a strategic marketing approach, which is jointly implemented by sales and marketing. It's about focusing on your key target accounts, whether they're customers or not. So it could be growth or it could be new accounts. And in terms of dropping down a level, it's about identifying who your most important accounts are, gathering as much insight on them as possible, and then using that insight to align your propositions to the challenges they're facing and crafting really personalized sales and marketing campaigns to engage them, obviously, and ultimately to win their business. So hopefully that sets the scene. It's also really important that you don't kind of have this as a marketing initiative, if you like, and then let's try to push that into the organization. I think it's really important that you have executive sponsorship for your ABM strategy and programs right from the outset. The road may get bumpy at times, and you definitely want to be able to engage the right people to give you the support you need at all times. So I would suggest that the first thing you do is define your ABM program and then make sure that your senior executive team have bought into it. And, very often ABM is actually almost a change management program where you need to be bringing the organization into a new focus and a new way of working with your key accounts and prospects. The other piece that I've mentioned already, which is extremely important, is getting sales and marketing working together. ABM is definitely not a marketing initiative that's done for sales. It needs to be a joint initiative where sales and marketing are working hand in hand right from the beginning of the program into the delivery, and obviously into closing, accounts and prospects as you're working through that process. So in terms of developing your ABM strategy, if you've done any cursory research on ABM, you will probably have seen a pyramid or a triangle a little like this. But essentially, there are three main tiers or approaches to ABM. The top tier, as you can see, is one-to-one. That's mission critical accounts that you've got to win or you've got to defend. And you're going to be looking at, very large deal sizes, very large average order contract value, and you're going to be focusing on a relatively small number of accounts. One to few is obviously scaling that, and it's looking at high touch accounts, probably clustering them together in verticals or certainly into groups where those accounts would have a significant amount of business drivers and pain points that are consistent, so that you can talk to them potentially as a group. And one-to-many is much more about demand gen, or if you like, early stage engagement, where you're still looking at named accounts, but you're really looking at bringing them into the top of the funnel to talk to them in an appropriate way from a very early stage. And as you'll see, as I kind of go through the deck, I'm a great advocate of actually taking a blended approach, where you might have a couple of one-to-one accounts in play, you might have a vertical in play, and you might be using one-to-many, almost in a sort of quasi-demand gen sense, to bring companies in, targeted accounts, named accounts, but to bring them into the top of the funnel for the first time. I often get asked, well, how many accounts could we cope with in each section or sector, and how should we cluster these? And I would say that, most companies are probably not going to be doing more than 5 to 10 one-to-one accounts in a given year. They are resource intensive from a time point of view, from a resource point of view, and obviously from a budget point of view. When you look at one to few, it's quite feasible to be saying, well, we'll look at a vertical like financial services, we'll pick off 10 accounts within that cluster, and then we will start to create our value proposition and messaging to a group of accounts, albeit personalizing it in the actual delivery. And one-to-many, I would suggest you could probably think about air cover across all of your key accounts. But as I say, they should be named accounts. This isn't just kind of a spray and pray approach. It's still taking a pretty focused approach to your most important accounts. Excuse me. Another option, rather than starting, if you like, at the top of the pyramid, is to say, well, what we want to do is to start with the always-on coverage. And then from there, we will actually identify which accounts will make it into the one-to-few program or the one-to-one program. And in this context, and obviously this example, you can see there are 250 target accounts. You're going to be landing digital communications into each of them. But what you may well want to do is to actually qualify the accounts that should come into the one-to-few and one-to-one by their level of engagement. And another thing that you might want to think about is looking at some of the new intent-based platforms where you can actually track these 250 companies and to see what kind of content they're consuming, which will obviously give you an early warning system of which accounts you should be focusing on. Another way of looking at it, rather than top down, is left to right. So this is about taking the right ABM approach based on where your customers are in the customer life cycle. And, a pretty standard life cycle in the middle, as you can see, from awareness through engagement, finally into winning, and then obviously about retaining, cross-selling, and ultimately winning the customers' hearts and minds, to have them as advocates for your business. And this is really just a guide. There are no fixed rules here, but I would say if you're looking at target accounts, then one-to-many for early stage engagement and one-to-few for a more sophisticated approach probably makes sense. If you're looking at large bids, RFPs, where you might be looking at a multi-million-dollar response to something, then clearly one-to-one makes absolute sense, as long as you have the time to actually make the program fly. And I would say that's a minimum of 3 months and ideally longer than that. One-to-few obviously is a suitable backup, if you like, to the one-to-one approach for bid support, and still enables you to create a pretty personalized approach. And then when you get into upsell, cross-sell, and advocacy to existing customers, obviously this is going to be much more about where you are in the customer lifecycle in terms of, have they just bought and are they likely to buy again within the next 12 to 24 months? If they are, then one-to-one might be highly appropriate. If it looks like, they've bought all they're going to buy from you for the next 2 or 3 years, then you might think more about a one-to-few or even a one-to-many approach. But all of these are kind of building blocks that you need to be thinking about what's going to be right for your business and for the accounts you're targeting. Another approach that you might want to think about, which is becoming increasingly popular, is to look at partner-based ABM. And this is essentially where you would look at your key partners, channel partners or strategic partners, and actually work out where you might have a joint value proposition to market that's going to be stronger than yours alone. And if you take the pyramid model again, at the top of the pyramid, you've got doing ABM to your partners. So this would be a partner, probably of significant size and scale, where perhaps you don't have the level of coverage or the level of knowledge or relationships that you want. And in that context, you might actually be doing ABM to the partner to get them to engage in the first place. The second level down is probably the sweet spot. And this is really where you're doing ABM with a partner. So this would be you with the partner, creating a joint value proposition, selecting the accounts that you want to go after, and then obviously landing messaging that would benefit both organizations. And the beauty of this approach, obviously, is that you've got the IP and the experience and knowledge of both companies coming together, but typically you've also got the budget being shared. So this is either halving your cost or doubling the size of your program, if you like. The third level down is a little bit more esoteric, but is starting to be looked at by different companies I've been working with. And this is actually where you're looking more at a two-tier distribution model, where you might be helping resellers actually do ABM to their customers, but benefiting you and your channel partners. So you might be driving the research and the insight into a sector. You might be coming up with the value proposition and messaging, but you would then be making that available to your channel partners for them to take out to their customers. So in that sense, it should definitely be, a win-win. In terms of selecting the right accounts, I'm not going to go into too much detail today, but this is really just to say that you really need to think about it. This shouldn't be something where you take, the top 5 recommendations from sales and work with it. It should be something where you're thinking about the opportunity, which is obviously the size and scale of the account. You're thinking about the achievability in terms of, do we have a realistic chance of winning this? Do we have a position that we could either displace the competition or build on existing relationships? And a cooperation index, which is actually the internal view to say, are sales and marketing aligned on this account? And do we have the resources we need to go off and win it? So again, all of these slides can be made available to you. I would suggest you think carefully about the account selection process. In terms of defining the ABM process, there are 3, or rather, there's a consistent approach, I guess, across the 3 different models of one-to-one, one-to-few, and one-to-many. And this first one, as you can probably see, is the one-to-one. I would suggest that if you've come up with the one-to-one account that you want to move forward with, the very first thing you need to do is to scope the program. So this would be getting the key stakeholders, whether it's sales, marketing, customer success, and any other key stakeholders that you want to involve, into a workshop to agree, where are we today? What traction have we achieved? Who do we know? Where are the sort of successes we've had? Potentially, where are the challenges and blockers that we need to deal with? And then from there, you're talking about, where do we want to go? So what are the account objectives? What would success look like? What are the KPIs we need to be thinking about? And how are we going to work together? The final piece of the jigsaw in the first session is working out where the gaps in our knowledge are. And as I said earlier, ABM is very heavily disposed to wanting to find the right research and insight to really be able to engage the account. You need to understand where the gaps are in your knowledge to build your research brief, which takes you into the second pillar. The second pillar then basically is building out the account insight. Who are all the key stakeholders? What are their contact details? But more importantly, what does the company look like? Structure, organizational, financial, who are the key stakeholders? What's their strategy? Looking at our business, whether it's technology or professional services or any other, what's the landscape look like in terms of their existing suppliers and partners? And ultimately, what we're trying to do is to build an opportunity analysis that says, based on everything we've found out about this account, this is where we think we should land. Once you have that research in place, then you can move into the strategy and planning side of things, which used to be a half-day workshop. Typically now, with people working remotely, is a couple of 90-minute sessions. And it would be running through the research with your sales team, looking at their account plan potentially, and then mapping the opportunities and focus areas that you really want to take forward, and building that into an account plan, obviously, that is going to be driven by this ABM activity. You're then into pillar 4, which is, now we know what we want to do, what's our story, how are we going to create our value proposition that's going to resonate with this account, what are the supporting messages, and how are we actually going to take this to market. And once you have that piece done, then you can obviously summarize a value proposition and positioning, and you can get into the go-to-market plan, which is obviously the 5th pillar you can see there, where we get into campaign execution. That might be leveraging existing assets, but it's probably going to be building bespoke assets that you can use into the account that will really feel like you're talking to them about their business rather than your business. The final piece in the one-to-one process is the ROI and measurement. And I would suggest as a minimum, you're going to be wanting to land the program in month 3. By the end of that first quarter, you'll want to be reviewing the activity and working out what you're going to do moving forwards. So in a nutshell, that's the one-to-one ABM process. To give you a sort of visual version of that flow chart there, you kick off with the scoping workshop, you move into the research and insight, you build your stakeholder and contact build. You then get into developing your strategy of how are we going to engage this account. You then build your value proposition and messaging, and then of course you build out your go-to-market plan. And once you've got all of that in place, you can obviously then start actually creating the assets that you want to land. And this is just very representative, if you like, of a particular account that's been worked on. And this was talking about producing ebooks, producing a microsite with emails driving people to that microsite, building a blueprint that could be used physically in meetings, and obviously white papers off the back of that. And then potentially thinking about creating persona perspective papers where you're talking to individual stakeholders within the business. So it might be the CTO or the CISO or the CEO. They've all got different angles on what you're doing and how you can help them. And then we're also big fans of creating thought leadership by using social media, which obviously helps you to position either subject matter experts within your business or key salespeople, and helps them to build out their network on LinkedIn and other platforms of people within this account that they can talk to. To kind of show you what the one-to-one process would look like when you transpose it to one-to-few, then essentially you'll see it's a very similar structure. The only difference now is, rather than perhaps looking at Barclays, we might be looking at UK banks. We would scope the program based around looking at our footprint in the sector, the success we've achieved there so far, what our objectives are, and again, defining what the research needs might be. And then rather than perhaps just running a single account profile from the research point of view, we'd look at it from a sector perspective, where we would be looking at the industry as a whole, and then building out insights that we could use in our strategy, in our value proposition, and then obviously into the campaign execution. And the one addition you might just be able to make out there is, I would normally suggest you look at doing mini account profiles, certainly account builds for each account you're targeting in a one-to-few program, because obviously you want to be able to talk to each account on a personalized basis. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the one-to-many in too much detail, but as you can probably see, I'm very keen that you keep a consistent structure. The difference now is you might be looking at 500 accounts, or you might be looking at 250. So it's about building out your strategic objectives for the one-to-many program. Then it's working out how you can segment them. And then, of course, it's working out the most effective way to land messaging into different stakeholders in different accounts using some kind of technology platform to be defined. So just looking at the ABM program in detail, and again, I'll keep this very light in the interest of time. There's the ABM kickoff workshop. This is all about the current status, objectives, KPIs, research requirements, but most importantly, it's about getting sales and marketing really aligned and tightly working together on the same account. Then you get into the role of insight. As I said earlier, you would do one-to-one profiles in a one-to-one campaign. Not surprisingly, you do an industry sector review in the one-to-few, and you might be thinking about executive profiles to help you with particular accounts. In all cases, you want an opportunity analysis that will help you understand exactly where you can land. And probably self-evidently, you would also have stakeholder identification and relationship mapping, across the board. And this just gives you an idea of what a profile might look like. You can see they're pretty substantial, the slide numbers down the right, but a company overview, finances, execs, strategic priorities, a SWOT, the industry, in this case, a tech client, so an ICT landscape, and then the opportunity analysis. And the same kind of thing from a sector perspective. Then we get into the strategy workshop. So this is reviewing the account plan, defining business drivers and pain points, mapping opportunities and focus areas, and leaving with a really clear idea of what we're going to do. And then we get into the value proposition and messaging. So this is all about looking at the account or the sector and really creating a compelling story with an overarching value proposition and a series of supporting messages underpinned by why they should believe us. And there are typically 4 questions that I would answer: account drivers, how we can help, what are benefits and outcomes, and then the why us. So you end up with a messaging matrix that looks a bit like this, and then you get into the campaign activation. So this is a sample go-to-market plan. You'd typically be thinking about 3 to 6 months. You'd have your hero assets at the top. You'd have your communications that are going to drive people to those assets in the second tier. Potentially, you'd think about LinkedIn advertising to extend the reach. And then you'd obviously have a call to action, which might be taking people to round tables or webinars or even meetings if things are going the way they are at the moment. And then, of course, there are the assets themselves. In this case, building storybooks and videos, and then building microsites and other communications, obviously, to engage the customer. So finally, last slide before we get into some Q&A, how do we measure this stuff? Obviously, it's complex, but it isn't just about, how quickly can we do the deal. At the bottom level, you'll see there, it's all about creating the right teamwork within the organization with shared goals and collaboration and getting sales and marketing aligned. In the next level up, you can see it's really about understanding the account in significant detail, which is about, the research and the insight phase. And then the next level up from there, you get into creating content that is really going to resonate with your customer. Penultimately, you get into building relationships and conversations. And ultimately, of course, it's about sustainable revenues and conversion. And you can see on the left, we're moving from soft KPIs to hard KPIs. So that's the whistle-stop tour. I hope that was useful. Now we need to get into some Q&A, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Brilliant. Perfect. Thank you, Robert. So if anybody's got any questions from the audience, please feel free to pop them into the question box on the right-hand side. We've got some questions that our MLC community gathered ahead of time. So I'm conscious that we've got 5 minutes left. So I'm just going to dive straight into it. The first one that I've got for you, Robert, is: what is the right balance of inbound and outbound within your ABM strategy?
Well, it's a really good question. I think if you're looking at one-to-many, then clearly inbound is going to be something that you're using heavily because you're talking to a large number of accounts and you're looking for them to engage at an early stage. I think if you're looking at a smaller number of accounts, potentially even on a one-to-one basis, then really it is about outbound. It's about knowing exactly who you want to talk to and then taking a very precise set of messaging to them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We've got somebody in the question section that has asked if they could have a copy of the presentation. So we'll be sharing this at the end. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm very happy to share the presentation. People can either contact me directly or they can contact you, Nikita, and we can find out the best way of sharing it.
Brilliant. Perfect. That sounds great. Thank you for answering that one. So the next one I've got is: how big or small? I actually think you answered this within your presentation. How big or small should my target account list be? And I heard you say no more than 10.
Well, it's a big question. If you're looking at early stage engagement, which is almost a sort of ABM filter on demand gen, then you might be looking at a couple of hundred accounts. You know, you might even go crazy and say, I'm going to use an intent platform to track 500. But
Wow.
that's really about very early stage engagement, and it's, you know, it's kind of quasi ABM with a demand gen overlay. If you're looking at targeting particular verticals, then I'd say 10 to 15 accounts per vertical would be a logical number.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're looking at one-to-one, then probably start small, you know, with 2 or 3 accounts, prove the concept, get the organization bought in and behind you, and then look to scale it quarter on quarter. But this is where ABM can be quite complicated, in the sense that, you know, one-to-one, one-to-few, and one-to-many are actually fundamentally different, and therefore you need to build your strategy based around the type of organization you are, the type of organizations you're targeting, and the deal size. You know, if your deal size is £1 million plus, then one-to-one makes a lot of sense. But if your deal size is 20 to 50K, then one-to-one is going to be quite difficult to justify, and you're probably going to be using more of a one-to-many and a one-to-few mix.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And what's your recommended tools for account-based marketing, like technical tools or platforms or anything like that?
Yeah, it's a complicated one with a minute to go, but I would say, as an absolute minimum, you need a CRM system that the sales team are actively using and populating, that marketing have access to. And you need an outbound, inbound solution that will enable you to send communications and track the incoming responses to that. So I won't get into particular brands today, but, you know, I'm sure people know who the usual suspects are.
Yeah.
I think moving from there, you know, there are obviously platforms and tools that enable you to personalize content. There are platforms and tools that give you firmographic information so that you can look at what kinds of organizations, you know, you're targeting and talk to within them. And then also intent is a relatively new technology that is obviously being deployed quite heavily in ABM, which enables you to keep a track of a very significant number of companies to see which ones are in market and which ones are interested in your topics of interest at any one time.
Okay. I've heard of one called Terminus before. Have you used that? Is that very popular or
Yeah,
successful?
Terminus is pretty much an ABM platform. It's geared up to do quite a lot of the things I've mentioned. It provides intent, but it also provides a lot of the tools to actually land the communications. I didn't get into naming names because obviously, you know, there are dozens of
Yeah.
ABM technologies out there, and it's a question of finding the right ones, doing the due diligence, and making sure that, you know, you pick the partner of choice.
Yep. We're about to cut off, so thank you so much. I'm not sure. Oh, the room's ended now. There we go. So I just ended it. Thank you so much.
All right.
Well, no, yeah. So thank you for your time today. If you could share the presentation, that would be great, and we will email that out to everybody. So yeah, I better hop on to the next session, but I'll speak to you soon.
All right. Thanks, Nikita.
Thank
Take
you
care.
so much. Take care. Bye bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.